Welcome back, everyone. As promised, we're picking up with Colossians chapter 3 at verse 18.
Oh, you get to read, John.
Great.
Why don't you read through chapter 4, verse 1?
All right. We'll do this after a station identification break. This is Two Beards in the Bible. I'm John Swano.
Dave Tenney.
And now we'll pick up with your regularly scheduled programming. Colossians 3 and at verse 18 beginning. To the end of the chapter, you said?
Chapter 4, verse 1.
All right. Verse 18 beginning. Wives, submit to your own husbands, as is fitting in the Lord. Husbands, love your wives, and do not be bitter toward them. Children, obey your parents in all things, for this is well-pleasing to the Lord. Fathers, do not provoke your children, lest they become discouraged. Bondservants, obey in all things your masters according to the flesh, not with eye service as men pleasers, but in sincerity of heart, fearing God. And whatever you do, do it heartily as to the Lord, and not to men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the reward of the inheritance, for you serve the Lord Christ. But he who does wrong will be repaid for what he has done, and there is no partiality. Masters, give your bondservants what is just and fair, knowing that you also have a master in heaven.
All right. I don't know why they started verse 4 on that verse. That obviously goes with the chapter 3.
Yeah.
I think that's proof that the numbering system wasn't inspired.
Right.
Okay, so, John, you take this over.
Yeah, you gave me the good one.
Ephesians chapter 6, which we already studied, says almost the exact same thing. So we've kind of already talked about this, but we'll just go through it verse by verse. It says, wives, submit to your own husbands as is fitting in the Lord. And if you disagree with that, I don't know what to tell you.
Yeah, and anybody that could have a contention with this idea has a gross misunderstanding of the end of that sentence.
Yep.
In the end of that sentence, as is fitting in the Lord.
Yeah.
Well, that in and of itself, if you read that and you're a little hot under the collar because of this whole submission thing, then
I'm not having no man put his thumb on me.
Right. Then you need to find out what is fitting or pleasing to the Lord.
Yeah.
And when you go down that rabbit hole, you find out that the Lord wants us to treat each other, husbands and wives, as equals, as our own body. That we would take care of them just as we would our own body.
Yeah, even and I can't remember where this scripture is at, but Paul gives some instructions to women who are married to unbelievers, and they're to submit to their husband too.
Yeah.
It has nothing to do with better, worse, any of those things. It just has to do with this is God's order, and I think it goes back to God created Adam, man first.
Yeah, well, and perhaps, to open up the can of worms a little more, perhaps it has to do with the goings-on in the garden.
Yeah.
And who was deceived.
Yeah.
And
that's stated as well.
Yeah.
So that's the only thing I could say is that is what it is.
Yeah. And it's not, there may be some who, to their discredit, would try to stand upon that and see men are superior to women.
Yeah, that's not what this is saying.
That's not at all. That's never what the scriptures say.
Right. So in the same breath, so he gives instructions to wives, husbands, and children. So women are supposed to submit to their husband. Mm-hmm. Husbands are to love their wives and not be bitter towards them. Mm-hmm. So if you're the husband and you think your wife is not submitting to you in the manner that God would have her submit to you, it may be because you are not loving her the way that God would have you love her.
Right.
So it goes. These things kind of go hand in hand.
And there's another wrinkle to this that I've seen in the world, in order for a wife to submit to a husband, the husband has to be willing to lead.
Absolutely.
You know, so there's a way that's been set forth by the Lord, and we all have to stand up to it. Just because you're a man,
Yeah.
doesn't just automatically
Yeah.
mean that you're worthy of
Yeah.
being submitted to.
Yeah.
You know? And so that submission needs to happen. Make no mistake, but you have to live up to your end of the bargain so that can be done. You know, it's a total two-way street there.
Yeah, absolutely. So husbands are supposed to love their wives, and we're not supposed to be bitter towards them.
Right.
I mean, I have seen that in action.
Yeah, I mean, if you turn on, yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
I've seen husbands that were they were just in it to get out of it. You know, they were waiting to die.
Right.
You know,
And if you turn on, the television, popular culture, I can think of several television shows from even our childhood where the man, speaks down to his wife.
Yeah.
And is kind of bitter, would be a good way to put it. And there's just, it looks like a loveless relationship.
like Archie Bunker.
Kind of, sort of.
Kinda, sorta.
Yeah. There are worse offenders, but, absolutely. And so there's that sort of a thing that is perpetuated by Satan, because, to drive that wedge between that union that the Lord made for a specific purpose and to be the most wonderful thing that we experience here on this earth. To have a loving life that is with you in the steps that you take in life is wonderful.
It's a partnership.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And then some advice to children. Children, obey your parents in all things, for this is pleasing to God. There are some kids, I think there are some kids that don't understand this, but more importantly, there are some parents that don't understand this.
Right.
And it always surprises me when I see anywhere I go somewhere and I see children that aren't obedient to their parents, and I want to slap the parents, not the kids.
I don't
what
remember.
Are you doing?
I don't remember where I was this week. I think I was I had taken my son to a doctor's appointment, and so in walks this 7-year-old girl with her mom, and the secretaries obviously knew her and said, "Oh, there she is. Hi, how are you?" And the mom came in and said, "Yep, that's Miss Sassy Pants." And it was like a switch flipped on in that little girl. And the secretary was like, "Well, can you tell me your name?" And the girl was like, "No." And then, "Can we get your temperature?" "No." And everything was no. And I'm like, you just made that happen.
Oh yeah.
And again, going with if you're going to be a husband that leads, you have to be willing to lead.
Yeah.
In order to have your child be obedient to you and to submit to you, you have to live up to the part.
Yeah, absolutely.
You have to have the authority, and not that you're going to be some kind of villain. Not that you beat them to death to get that submission. Because I can tell you with with one of my sons, there came a point where this scripture about don't break them. What is it?
Don't fathers do not provoke your children lest they become discouraged.
You
were getting to that point.
Getting to the point where I'm like, this is. I need to try something different because spanking this child didn't seem to work. So I had to figure out what it was that really got to his core.
You didn't know how to put a hurt on him.
So I had to take, because the physical pain wasn't working. But anyway, and I realized that at some point there's going to be, he's going to be angry about this. He's going to have a lot of angst about our relationship unless we can establish some things here. And so I figured out that taking some things away from him, some privileges, really seemed to help. And I think it improved our relationship. It was helpful there. And if I had just kept on with stern, just punishment, then I think that things would be different.
Yeah. I mean, our sons are the same age. They're 16. I talk to my son like a man.
Yeah.
And when he does something wrong, I make him own up to it like a man.
Right.
He has to.
Right.
And that's fathers. You have to at some point. We're at that point where it changes.
Yeah.
Things change.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So.
Yeah.
But you definitely. I think if you get your kids on the right path early.
Yeah.
Then the rest of it goes pretty darn easy.
There was another situation recently where this was the other son. I had asked him a question, and he answered in a way that I just didn't think was. I thought he should have been doing something different. But instead of saying, "Well, I think you should," I said, "Oh, maybe you should think about that," and then I just let it be. Yeah. And then a few days later, he came to me and said, "I'm going to do this," and I'm like,
Yeah.
"Good." And so it was just that instilling of the. I didn't tell him what to do, but I made him think, and that's something that the Lord, it's pretty spelled out in the scriptures what we should do, but it's kind of written in a way that makes us think. It's not It's not all fire and brimstone.
Charlie was playing some video game last night, and I was sitting there watching him, and the video game talked about the Pinkertons.
Oh.
And I said, "Oh, do you know who that is?" And he said, and he tried to give me some answer, and he's like, "No." I said, "Oh, well, tomorrow night you better know who they are." We'll talk about it.
It's a learning experience.
Yes. Okay, so
I might go look up the Pinkertons myself.
Well, you should. The children, obey your parents in all things first as well. He says, fathers, do not provoke your children. Now he talks about bondservants. Of course, back then, we're talking about slaves. Mm-hmm. In the Roman Empire, there were lots of slaves, and they were considered, I believe the term is chattel, but it rhymes with cattle, and it means about the same thing.
Right.
They didn't regard them as human.
Right.
More or less. And so here's the instructions for the bondservant. Obey your masters according to the flesh, not with eye service as men pleasers, but in sincerity of heart, fearing God. And whatever you do, do it heartily as to the Lord and not to men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the reward of your inheritance, for you serve the Lord Christ. So, I even though, I would say, in the United States and most of the Western world, there is no slavery. But, we probably have a job. Mm-hmm. And the one thing that I've learned, not just at work or whatever I do, I try to do that. Yeah. I try to do a good job because God wants me to do a good job. Yeah. And that's my motivator. It has nothing to do with work or the people at work or promotions or anything. Just I'm supposed to be a hard worker, and I'm going to do everything I can to do that.
Right. And that is something that stands out. In the people notice those things.
Oh yeah.
Because not everybody
does that. No, not at all.
Yeah. It was something else that popped up in my mind here is, you have in verse 19, husbands love your wives and do not, we need to go back a verse, I think. Yeah, verse 18. Wives, submit to your own husbands as is fitting in the Lord. So there's the Lord having the authority. And down here, when it talks about bondservants, it says, bondservants, obey in all things your masters according to the flesh. So it hasn't nullified Christ's authority,
right?
Of eternal authority.
Absolutely, that's a good point.
So even in there, even those that are the slave owners, I suppose you could say, those that owned these bondservants or were in charge over them, they still had to answer to just as all mankind does. They had to answer to the Lord.
Now, this is one of those things I think some people can get upset about this. The Bible doesn't condemn slavery. It doesn't.
Right?
It gives instructions how slaves should act and how masters should act. And here it says here's the instruction for the masters. Well, I'll start in verse 25. It says, "He who does wrong will be repaid for what he has done, and there is no partiality. Whether you're a slave or free, it doesn't matter."
No.
God's gonna. So then he talks about masters. Masters, give your bondservants what is just and fair, knowing that you also have a master in heaven.
Right.
So masters are to be just and to be fair.
Right. Mankind asked for this idea of a hierarchy among men.
Yes.
Way
back in Genesis.
Yeah.
Actually.
Yeah, that's what I was kind of scrolling
Yeah.
back there. We don't even need to go there, but the idea that, that Israel asked, they didn't want to listen to God, so they decided that they wanted to have a king, somebody to rule over them. And God told them, give them that, but warn them that they're not going to like it, And even, I guess, even further than that, back to the garden, when there was freedom, and then sin, basically with the understanding that if you take part of this fruit and you step over that line, you're going to be enslaved to it, and that's something that happened in this realm. It's not a part of God's creation. It's really something that is kind of a creation of man, and God's eternal purpose is our eternal soul.
Yeah.
And he's telling people, no matter how you find yourself on this earth, live to answer to God.
Yep. Yeah, someday I want to get a job where I don't have to make a lot of decisions.
Yeah.
Where I can just, tell me what to do and I'll do it.
Yeah.
And, there's a certain freedom in that.
Yeah.
But
I remember lamenting when I went from working at the driving school that I did in college, when I went from being an employee that could say, no, I don't want to come in on those days. We could pick our schedule.
Yeah.
And I don't want to come in on those days because I have classes or whatever.
Yeah.
To then becoming the manager who had to be there every day, and if someone called off, guess who was teaching the class?
Yeah.
And I remember thinking, who's got the better end of this?
Oh yeah, exactly. Yeah. There's a lot.
It's a give and take.
It is, yeah. There's a lot of truth to that.
Right.
But
as we go through our lives, we have to be those that treat others, even if we have rule over somebody in some way. We have to treat them well.
Just and fair, right?
Yeah,
right. And if that was done throughout humanity, then we'd still have slavery. Mm-hmm. It'd still be a thing. Yeah, because it wouldn't be that bad.
Yeah. To cut even more to the point, if people would just love one another and just treat each other like the Lord has told us to, there wouldn't be wars.
Right. There
wouldn't be all of the backbiting that we see out in the world.
Absolutely.
And it's so simple, and it's just right there, but it's so difficult to implement because of people's self-will.
One of the things that, it's hard for us to understand. You think about the Roman culture. They had slavery, but they didn't have the same kind of society. If you didn't pay back a debt, you had a couple of options. Mm-hmm. One, you could probably go to prison, and you're probably going to die there pretty soon.
Right.
Or you could run away and just hope you get away with it. Or you can go to somebody and say, hey, I'm in debt. If you help me out, I'll work for you.
Right.
And a lot of times, sometimes there was a set period of time, and sometimes there wasn't.
Right.
And it was an economic system that that we don't have today.
Yeah, and sometimes those that were in the position of being in charge, sometimes they didn't deal fairly with those.
Yeah, no doubt.
Yeah.
And I mean, and you had nations that would conquer other nations, and of course Rome was really good at that, and they'd bring a bunch of slaves back. So for the slave, I mean, they had two options. They were really going to either be killed or they got to live.
Right.
And that was kind of where they were at. It was a different world than we live in.
Yeah. And it's not making excuses for
just
things that are wrong, but you have to take history.
Yeah.
When we have that perfect 20/20 hindsight.
Yeah.
Looking back, you have to take it with some context.
Hey, if we didn't have some of the economic systems that we have now, well, that we would have slavery again.
Yeah.
Because what are you going to do?
Right.
It's an out.
Yeah. And I often think I mention it from time to time because it just seems to apply. You think of Nazi Germany, and you think of all of the people that they were faced with. I go along with this fella, or I die.
Right.
And we'd like to stand on our high horse and think, well, I would have.
I wouldn't do that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But history kind of shows that, a lot of people would.
Yeah, most people would do that.
So.
And, it's just, I think a lot of people will say, well, God can't be perfect because he didn't denounce slavery.
Right.
But understand that the world has not operated under the same economic systems as we have today. It's not always been that way.
And just like any sin, it's an exercise of our free will that God chose to give us.
Yeah.
And so, in the beginning, it was not so.
I mean, slavery isn't even called a sin.
Right.
I mean, the master's not condemned for being a slave master.
Right.
He's condemned for not treating his slaves correctly.
Right.
That's what, so, like I said, it's, in our country, it's a touchy subject in our country because we enslaved a certain race of people, and I guess that was kind of done back then too, in a way.
Yeah. Nothing's new.
Yeah, nothing's new. Mm-hmm. So,
Yeah.
I'm not trying to bring back slavery, though, John. I just want you to know that.
No, yeah, absolutely.
Nor am I really trying to defend it.
Right.
I'm just saying that, it's a thing that happens under certain conditions.
And that's true of a lot of the things that plague our society. We fight over whether or not this is wrong or this is wrong or this should happen or this should happen. But in reality, if we just get down to the base of what the problem is, we could fix it.
Yeah.
And the problem with slavery is not really slavery.
Right.
It's the love between men.
Yeah.
It's the desire to live in a godly way.
Yeah.
That is missing there.
Yeah.
And so again, it just is that simple. If people would just be obedient to the Lord, a lot of things everything would be better.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And if you want to really study, and we are going to study this later when we study Philemon, because that's a letter to a slave master of a runaway slave, and he's rebukes both of them basically. Mm-hmm. The slave ran away and he's got to go back.
Yeah.
And the master is a Christian, so when the slave comes back, he's got to deal with him kindly.
Right.
So, which is probably not the way things normally went. How much time we got there, Johnny? We got 5 minutes. All right, the Christian graces.
Oh, one more quick thing about,
as
you were saying, speaking of Philemon, there's contracts, sort of a contract between people.
Yeah.
And God wants us to honor our contracts. If we put ourselves into a situation, we have to honor that.
Yeah.
And that's just my
Yeah.
my last 2 cents there.
Oh, yeah.
Move on.
Yeah, if you think that the slavery of the Africans was terrible, you should read about the indentured servants that happened during the same time period, especially among the Irish.
Right.
Most of those people died.
Yeah.
They were given a raw deal.
Right.
But that,
Yeah, and there's throughout history there's many instances of that.
yeah.
Of that sort of thing, people mistreating people.
Oh, yeah. There's been lots of atrocities that's been done throughout history. And okay, chapter 4 and verse 2, it says, "Continue earnestly in prayer, being vigilant in it with thanksgiving. Meanwhile, praying also for us, that God would open to us a door for the word to speak the mystery of Christ, for which I am also in chains, that I may make it manifest as I ought to speak. Walk in wisdom toward those who are outside, redeeming the time. Let your speech always be with grace, seasoned with salt, that you may know how you ought to answer each one." Of course, he's talking about how we deal with those of the world, mainly, right?
Yeah.
The speech that we use. What do you think he means by seasoned with salt?
Well, what do we use salt for? We use it to make things taste better, to
Yeah.
make up the flavor,
Yeah.
to make it more palatable.
Yeah.
And so, when we speak, we probably ought to make it so that it's not so the words aren't so stinging.
Yeah. Yeah. Or does he mean we should make it that way? No.
Well, again, Paul is a great wordsmith,
Yeah.
and when you notice, he has a way of writing that is both soft and harsh.
See, when I think of adding salt, I think of spicing something up a little bit.
Yeah.
So when I think about, like, maybe I'm wrong. This is the way I thought it was. Your speech is with grace, but it's also the truth. Mm-hmm. And sometimes the truth can be, a little hard to take.
Right.
I don't know.
Always be with grace, seasoned with salt, that you may know how you ought to answer each one.
I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. The grace is kindness.
Yes.
And, well, when we have something, just brainstorming, don't take this as anything much. But, when you speak of a dish that is particularly perhaps has some salt in it, speaking of food, you might call that thing savory.
Yeah.
And you have sweet as far as, candy and stuff, you have sweet and savory.
Or something that doesn't have salt might be kind of bland.
And so the right. And so the words that you speak need to be those that can be savored.
I think that's a good one. Those are all. I think
Yeah.
three of those things we mentioned are interesting.
And I think they can kind of work interchangeably too. I mean,
Yeah.
the words can cut to the heart,
Yeah.
like in Acts 2, but they don't have to be so harsh that you shut people off.
Right.
And that's that's
I think of Stephen's speech. Boy, he put a lot of salt on the end of that in Acts chapter 7.
yeah.
But it was definitely a very gracious speech up until that point.
Yeah.
Yeah. He told them what they had to hear.
Right. And that's the sting of the words that really comes from the person's conscience.
Yeah.
Because sometimes the words that you speak, they hit one person and it's a comfortable thing. They hit the next person and it hurts.
Yeah.
And nothing's changed with the speech. They heard the same words. So it's
That's very interesting. Well, John, let's see if we can get the final greetings. And why don't you just read 7 through the end of the chapter, and we're going to wrap this up.
Going to make me say this name. I'll do my best.
Tychicus.
The way I say it is Tychicus.
Oh, that's the way I could say it that way too.
Tychicus. Yeah, we'll bear with one another. Tychicus, a beloved brother, faithful minister, and fellow servant in the Lord, will tell you all the news about me. I am sending him to you for this very purpose, that he may know your circumstances and comfort your hearts. With Onesimus, a faithful and beloved brother, who is one of you. They will make known to you all the things which are happening here. Aristarchus, my fellow prisoner, greets you, with Mark, the cousin of Barnabas, about whom you received instructions. If he comes to you, welcome him. And Jesus, who is called Justus, these are my only fellow workers for the kingdom of God, who are of the circumcision. They have proved to be a comfort to me. Epaphras, who is one of you, a bondservant of Christ, greets you always, laboring fervently for you in prayers, that you may stand perfect and complete in all the will of God. For I bear him witness that he has a great zeal for you and those who are in Laodicea and those in Hierapolis. Luke, the beloved physician, and Demas greet you. Greet the brethren who are in Laodicea and Nymphas and the church that is in his house. Now, when this epistle is read among you, see that it is read also in the church of the Laodiceans, and that you likewise read the epistle from Laodicea, and say to Archippus, take heed to the ministry which you have received in the Lord, that you may fulfill it. This salutation by my own hand, Paul. Remember my chains. Grace be with you. Amen.
So probably not a whole lot to go over there. A lot of these greetings are, they're pretty self-explanatory. Onesimus is who Paul writes Philemon about. So that's interesting that he's in there. I think it's interesting that whatever problem Paul had with Mark, by this point it's straightened out. I think in 2 Timothy he also talks kindly about Mark. And if you've read the Bible, you know that Paul and Barnabas had a kind of an argument about Mark at one point, because Paul didn't think he was going to be steadfast enough to continue the journey. And since we read about Paul writing about him at least 2 other times, we know that Mark was he whatever changes he needed to make, he made those changes.
One other thing here, speaking of them being bondservants and Christians being bondservants of the Lord.
Yeah, just like slaves.
Right. And that lends itself to the idea that, the idea of the bondservant, is something that, as you pointed out, is not really spoken against. It's just that we have instructions that no matter how we find ourselves interacting with each other, it has to be according to the Lord.
In whatever situation you find yourself in, you can be a Christian in that situation, and I think that's what the lesson is from there. If you were a slave owner, you could be a Christian and be a slave owner. Now, maybe you might work to change that situation.
It would certainly look different than the opposite.
Yes, absolutely. But okay, and then he talks about this epistle that he wrote to Laodicea. Too bad we don't have a copy of that. Right. So apparently there's some letters Paul wrote that we don't have copies of. He said that he had written a letter to the Laodiceans, which I think we mentioned at the beginning is about 12 miles away from Colossae. So those people would have probably all kind of known each other.
Yeah.
And other than that, Paul signs it with his own hand.
Yeah.
Other than that, I don't have anything else. How about you?
Yeah. Well, he closes out with "Remember my chains."
Yeah.
And that's I don't know how to take that. I mean, in one.
Well, he's in prison.
But in one regard, it could be that you pray for him.
Yeah.
And certainly that would be the case, as I know the brethren would have been doing.
Yeah.
But also as an example, because he's in chains, yet he
Yes.
still manages to
Yep.
lead the church.
In whatever situation he's in, he's doing
Yeah.
what he does.
Yeah. So that's kind of an interesting way to end that.
Absolutely.
It's whether I'm digging deeper meaning out of there than it was meant, I don't know, but it's an interesting thought.
All right, John, let's wrap her up.
All right. Well, thanks for joining in. We will see you next time beginning in 1 Thessalonians.